It was the largest military operation in human history. 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, 2,000 aircraft, all launched in a single morning against one nation. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, a blitzkrieg assault on the Soviet Union stretching nearly 2,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. No warning, no declaration of war. For the Soviet soldiers stationed along the border, it began with a sound they had never heard before. A sound that turned the sky orange. We thought it was our own artillery conducting exercises. Until the shells started falling on us. In the next 6 months, the Soviet Union would suffer the worst military catastrophe ever endured by any nation in history. And yet Germany would still lose the war. Barbarossa was the moment that turned Hitler's ambition into Germany's ruin. Why? How does the most powerful military force in the world, at the height of its power, fail to finish what it started? This is the real story behind Operation Barbarossa, the decision that ultimately decided the fate of World War II. It is also the moment that marked the beginning of Germany's defeat. To understand Barbarossa, you have to understand the world Hitler believed he was living in. By the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany had achieved something extraordinary. In less than 2 years, Hitler had conquered Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France. Britain was isolated, battered by the Blitz but unbroken. Hitler's ideology was built on a single obsession, Lebensraum, living space. The idea that the German people needed land to the east to survive and flourish as a master race, and that land, to Hitler, meant the Soviet Union. But there was a strategic calculation too. Hitler believed that once he crushed the Soviet Union, Britain would have no reason to fight on. America would stay out. Germany would control all of Eurasia, because the Soviet Union stood in the way. At this point in history, the Soviet Union was technically a partner. In 1939, Hitler and Stalin had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement that shocked the world. The two ideological enemies had carved up Eastern Europe between them. But Hitler never intended to keep it. From the moment he signed it, the Soviet Union was always the target. The pact simply bought him time, letting him deal with the West first before turning east. That was Hitler's belief about the Soviet Union. His generals, some of them, weren't so sure. The plan for Barbarossa was sweeping in its ambition and terrifying in its confidence. 3 army groups would strike simultaneously. Army Group North would drive through the Baltic states toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the most powerful, would thrust directly toward Moscow. Army Group South would sweep into Ukraine, targeting Kiev and the vast agricultural and industrial heartland. The goal was not just military victory, it was annihilation. Hitler's orders specifically called for the extermination of the Soviet political class, the enslavement of Slavic peoples, and the seizure of Soviet resources because he intended to remake the East entirely. This was not a conventional war. From the very beginning, it was a war of racial extermination. German military planners estimated the campaign would last 8 to 10 weeks. They were basing that on one thing: what they had seen the Red Army do in the Winter War against Finland. In that conflict, a tiny nation had held off the Soviet behemoth for months, exposing catastrophic weaknesses in command, coordination, and morale. What the Germans couldn't fully account for was what Stalin had done since then, and what Stalin was still doing to his own army. In the Great Purge of the late 1930s, Stalin had executed or imprisoned the majority of the Red Army's senior officer corps. Thousands of experienced commanders gone. Replaced by loyalists with little battlefield experience, the Red Army was wounded. But it was not dead. And it was enormous. At 3:15 in the morning, on June 22, 1941, the German guns opened fire along the entire 2,000-mile front. The Red Army was caught completely off guard. Stalin had received dozens of intelligence warnings about the coming attack from his own spies, from the British, even from German deserters who crossed the lines days before. He had ignored everyone. He believed it was a provocation. He believed Hitler would not be so reckless. Within hours of the opening assault, the Soviet Air Force had lost over 1,000 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. German panzer columns drove 50, 60, sometimes 100 kilometers in a single day. They bypassed Soviet fortifications. They surrounded entire armies. They created massive encirclements called kessels, or cauldrons trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers at a time. The Battle of Bialystok-Minsk, the Battle of Smolensk. Each encirclement consumed entire Soviet armies. By the end of July, barely 5 weeks into the campaign, Germany had advanced 400 miles into Soviet territory. They had taken nearly 700,000 prisoners. The numbers were staggering. Unprecedented, the campaign against the Soviet Union has been won in 14 days. That was the assessment in Hitler's war diary on July 3, 1941. His generals believed the same. They were wrong. The first cracks appeared in August. Hitler made a fateful decision that would haunt his generals for decades. Instead of pushing Army Group Center directly toward Moscow, he diverted its armored forces north to support the Leningrad attack and south to support the drive on Kiev. His generals were furious. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, believed Moscow was the prize. Capture the capital, and the Soviet state would collapse. The rail network, the political heart, the psychological symbol, all of it sat in Moscow. Hitler disagreed. He wanted Ukraine's resources. He wanted to starve Leningrad. So, he believed Moscow could wait. The Kiev encirclement that followed was spectacular. Over 600,000 Soviet troops captured. The largest single military encirclement in history. On paper, a triumph. But it had cost 6 weeks. 6 precious weeks that Moscow never got back. By the time Operation Typhoon, the drive on Moscow, was finally launched in early October, the autumn rains had come, turning the roads of the Soviet Union, which were barely roads at all, to mud. The Germans called it the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. It turned their blitzkrieg to a crawl. Then came November. Then December. And with December came the final blow the German military planners had refused to plan for. Winter. The Wehrmacht had no winter equipment. No proper coats. No lubricant worked below freezing. Gun mechanisms froze. Tank engines wouldn't start. Frostbite casualties began to outnumber combat casualties, and the army's advance stalled. And on December 5, 1941, with German forward units able to see the spires of Moscow through binoculars, the Red Army counterattacked, turning the siege into a crisis for Germany. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic for Germany's strategic position. The failure to take Moscow had turned the campaign. By December 1941, the Wehrmacht had suffered over 800,000 casualties on the Eastern Front. The Red Army had absorbed unimaginable punishment and was still fighting, still producing, still mobilizing reserves from the vast depths of a country that simply dwarfed anything Germany had faced before. Hitler had gambled on a quick war. What he got was a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition against the Soviet Union, Germany had already lost. Barbarossa had become the fatal mistake that made defeat inevitable. The human cost was beyond comprehension. On the Soviet side, military deaths in 1941 alone reached nearly 3 million. Civilian suffering from occupation, from the deliberate German starvation policies, from the massacres carried out by SS Einsatzgruppen, would account for tens of millions more before the war ended. History would never be the same. Operation Barbarossa reshaped the modern world in ways we are still living with today. It drew the Soviet Union, which might otherwise have remained neutral or even aligned with Germany permanently, into the Allied cause, helping guarantee the destruction of Nazi Germany. And it began a process that would leave the Soviet Union, battered but victorious, as the dominant land power in Eurasia for the next 50 years. The Eastern Front remains the largest, bloodiest, and most consequential theater of World War II. More soldiers fought, more land changed hands, and more people died on the Eastern Front than in all other theaters of the war combined. And it all began with a single decision. A man staring east at a map, convinced he could destroy in 10 weeks what Napoleon could not destroy in 2 years. What history books often don't fully convey is not just the scale of Hitler's mistake, but also why he made it. He genuinely believed the Soviet Union was hollow, a rotten structure. One kick, and it would collapse. Instead, every kilometer the Wehrmacht advanced, the harder the Soviet resistance hardened. Every army Germany destroyed was replaced by 2 more. Every city Germany captured became a ruin that bled German forces dry. You only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Adolf Hitler, he was wrong about the door. He was wrong about the structure. And by the time he understood that, 3 million of his soldiers were already dead. Operation Barbarossa didn't just determine the outcome of World War II. It reshaped the entire second half of the 20th century and left scars across Eastern Europe that remain visible to this day. It was the turning point that set Germany's defeat in motion. If you want to understand why the modern world looks the way it does, why Germany lost the war, why the Cold War happened, why the Soviet Union became a superpower, it begins here. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, Barbarossa was the decision that changed everything. If this video brought history to life for you, hit like and subscribe. We go deep on the battles, decisions, and turning points that built our world.